Road Trip took the scenic route through the post-apocalypse and ended up on your PlayStation back in 1998. Developed by Singletrac and published by GT Interactive, Road Trip is sadly the last attempt for developer Singletrac at putting out a vehicular combat game, after they essentially created the genre with the Twisted Metal franchise. After leaving that series behind with the completion of Twisted Metal 2, Singletrac would eventually try their hand at the genre again with the underwater submarine-focused game Critical Depth, which was only really notable because of this one guy getting his face sucked off in the game's intro. My god, it never gets old. We've already covered Critical Depth on this channel in a previous review, so feel free to check it out if you're curious about that neat but flawed take on the Twisted Metal formula. Unfortunately, as unique and face-sucking as it was, Critical Depth never saw the success of Singletrac's more land-based car combat games. So in one final attempt to recapture the magic that Twisted Metal 1 and 2 had in spades, Singletrac set to work on basically just making Twisted Metal all over again, except this time with a whole new tourism gimmick, a bunch of late 90s stereotypes as characters, and a whole lot of ska music.
Hey folks, have a nice flight! Road trip, different kind of car, different kind of driver.
And while all that certainly sounds like a home run in terms of what maybe 10 of us kids thought would be cool at the time, would it be enough for Singletrac to pull in the rest of the masses for one last orgy of vehicle destruction? Well, if you're curious at all, then grab your favorite camera and every ska CD you can find, because we're about to see if Road Trip was worth the full tour. Start Road Trip up and sadly no one's face gets sucked off this time. Instead, you're tossed right into the game's awesomely over-the-top story, consisting of this hilarious RoboCop-style future where most of the country is left in ruin, with a completely hideous man going by the name of Big Daddy that's changing everything into generic tourist hotspots. And that's where you come in, since someone's gotta be the tour guide for these poor unfortunate tourists trying to get around. Actually, I'll just let this guy explain it.
Hey losers, need a vacation? Can't afford one of Big Daddy's snob fest? Don't despair, fight back. Hire an auto mercenary. These professional party crashers will hijack you on a high-speed, high-thrill, totally unauthorized vacation deep into the very heart of Big Daddy Land. And at a fraction of the cost. Our tricked-out battle rigs are fully loaded attack vehicles, armed to the teeth and ready for anything Big Daddy can throw at us. We fight the fights so you can see the sights. This has been a totally illegal, unpaid announcement for the Amalgamated Association of Auto Mercenaries. We now return you to your regularly scheduled crap!
And therein lies Road Trip's main gimmick this time around, as not only are you blowing up every other vehicle on the map just like every other vehicular combat game ever, but this time you're also in charge of picking up tourists and carting them around the level to gain more money crazy taxi style. As you begin each level, you'll see the tourist walking around waiting for someone to pick them up. Driving straight into them will put them into your vehicle, which immediately starts to give you cash as long as they stay with you. But just having them in your cracked out vehicle isn't all these tourists want. No, of course, they want to take pictures, and it's your job to get them to each individual photo op around the map, all the while avoiding every other vehicle that's trying to murder you and get the tourist for themselves. Successfully taking a photo will net you a huge chunk of change that can then be spent at stations that upgrade weapons and, more importantly, refill your health. That's right, there are no individual health packs sitting around levels anymore, so the only way to get your health back during a stage, which you'll definitely need to do, is to make enough money. You can find a bit of cash sitting around the level if you can't manage to get a tourist, but nothing compares to the chunk of cash you get from hauling tourists around and taking photos. As you can probably imagine, this definitely mixes up the tried and true car combat formula, as it's now not only about hunting down enemies, but also maintaining a cash flow from the tourists to survive. You can completely ignore the tourists if you want, since the goal of the game is still defeating every other vehicle to progress, but doing so makes the game far, far harder, and honestly, just not as much fun. Putting the whole tourism gimmick to the side, the rest of Road Trip will feel totally familiar to anyone that's played Twisted Metal 1 or 2. You pick from an assortment of over-the-top characters that all seem to have been pulled from what every 7th grader thought was funny or edgy back in 1998, including a midget that drives a giant wienermobile, a dominatrix nun that demands you get on your knees every time you pick her, and every game's favorite stand-in character for when nobody else has any better ideas, an Elvis impersonator, just to name a few. While they're all kind of funny in a time capsule sort of way, most just come off off as trying a bit too hard to be down with edgy kid culture of the time. The vehicles themselves also look like they could have come from literally any other game like this, with the Wienermobile being the only real standout in terms of things I still actually remembered being in the game. Thankfully though, once you start playing the game, all of that fades away, and you're left with the same insane action that us Twisted Metal fans had been craving since Twisted Metal 2. The vehicle physics are still every bit as ridiculous as they were in those games, with the cars sliding and jumping around using a physics model that honestly feels nothing like controlling a car. This is certainly not the more realistic car physics that games like Vigilante 8 use, but to me that's always been a plus, since the cars in Twisted Metal and Road Trip react less like a car sim and more like the fast-paced action game that it's supposed to be. To be fair, Singletrac has changed the vehicles to be a little heavier this time around, giving you way less of the driving on a sheet of ice feel that dominated Twisted Metal 2. This keeps things feeling less frantic in general, but does allow for more time for you to plan out what you want to do rather than just drifting across the entire map if you turn too quickly. The actual act of shooting other cars with weapons is pretty much unchanged though, with all the standard stuff making an appearance like homing missiles, bombs, and flamethrowers scattered around each map. There are a few unique hidden weapons around there that aren't your standard ordinances, like being able to call down a meteor attack on vehicles that are out in front of you, or using this completely useless remote control missile that's way too slow to maneuver around, making it almost impossible to connect with anyone that isn't already sitting still. Individual vehicle super weapons are of course back as well, and they're just as ridiculous as ever, with cars turning into huge saw blades, shooting packs of wild poodles at you, or just knocking you around with a giant wiener. Unfortunately, a lot of the vehicle's super weapons this time require you to be right up on another car just to connect with it, which is generally never a great idea since being up close and personal with the cars in this game is a surefire way to get yourself killed, especially since the AI will target you above and beyond everyone else. Still though, the action is just as chaotic and over the top as ever, and the AI does do a good job of trying to follow you around, so there's not too much downtime. Unlike the slower paced hit and run style of Critical Depth, Road Trip returns the action back to fast and aggressive, as it always feels like there's something right in front of you to shoot at, and if not, then they're probably shooting at you, which is exactly what you want in a game like this. It wouldn't be a great car combat game if you didn't have awesome stages for all that action to take place in, and Road Trip certainly delivers here as well. After the barren ocean levels in Critical Depth that probably just ended up putting most players to sleep, Road Trip is all about going back to the over-the-top layouts of its previous games. The campaign is spread out over 12 maps across a post-apocalypse US, going from a bombed-out Los Angeles airport, a Washington DC that's been turned into Big Daddy's kitschy tourist hotspot, an earthquake-leveled San Francisco, and of course, Area 51, complete with UFOs flying around. Besides the maps just being overall fun to drive around in and shoot stuff, there's a lot more verticality going on here than what we saw in either Twisted Metal game, with ramps, hills, and structures jutting out all over the place, allowing you to get some pretty sweet airtime. The only downside of this being that there are far more areas now where you can accidentally get stuck in a corner, leaving you to pray that you can get out in time before the AI comes over and wrecks your life with multiple super weapons upside your face. And it goes without saying that all of these maps feature multiple secret and hidden areas to find if you can fend off the enemies long enough to explore. There's more than enough stages and variety throughout to keep the campaign from ever getting dull. Add in the completely over-the-top late 90s soundtrack that features the likes of Mighty Mighty Boss Tones along with several other artists, and I'm not sure the apocalypse has ever been this much fun to blow stuff up in. To say I was a huge fan of Road Trip would almost be doing this game a disservice. Even though I'd say that Twisted Metal 2 is still Singletrac's overall best game, I'd also say that Road Trip is probably the most fun. Adding in the tourism gimmick is something that adds so much more urgency and variety to the gameplay that it's kind of hard to go back to other car combat games that don't have it. But sadly, even though Road Trip was one of the best games in the genre, it came at the tail end of a whole lot of similar games that were all trying to cash in on the car combat fad, including Singletrac's previous game that failed to light a fire under anyone besides weird kids like me that still loved games like that. I guess it's pretty cool that Singletrac continued to stick with what got him to the party in the first place with Road Trip, but it too never hit the charts like Singletrac had probably hoped it would. Personally, I always considered Singletrac one of my favorite developers from back in that period, with the likes of Twisted Metal 2, the Jet Moto series, and Road Trip never leaving my CD case for the entirety of the time that I owned a PlayStation. Their games always seemed to have a distinct look and feel that just made them a ton of fun to play, especially if I had anyone around to play some split-screen co-op, which was another feature that just about all of their games included and excelled at. I guess we're at least lucky that Singletrac was able to make this love letter to the genre, even if Road Trip ended up being one last hurrah before the studio closed. In the end though, if you're a fan of the genre, and for some reason never experienced the insanity and fun that is Road Trip, then pick this one up as soon as you get the chance, since this is still one trip well worth going out of the way for.